We called it the ledger, though it wasn't a book, and it wasn't kept by anyone you could argue with. It was a placement authority, older than most of the crew at Millhaven Transit, and its only job was to look at a case file and decide whether the person inside it was viable for resettlement. Most were. Some weren't. The ones who weren't went into long hold, into stasis pods stacked 6 deep in a wing we didn't talk about much, and they waited there until a slot opened somewhere in the sublight lanes that wanted them. Sometimes a slot never opened. I'd worked intake for 11 years, and I knew better than to promise anyone it would. Millhaven wasn't much to look at. A ring station bolted together 3 decades back to catch the overflow from the war lanes, its corridors always a little too cold, its lights always a little too white. The intake booth sat at the mouth of the docking arm, and from my chair I watched every ship that came limping in, freighters missing engines, transports missing hulls, vessels that shouldn't have been flying at all. I'd learned to read a ship's condition before its passengers ever crossed the threshold, and that the worse the ship, the more the ledger tended to distrust whoever had flown it. Case 5518 came through on a transport that shouldn't have made it as far as our dock, hull scorched along one side, engines running on fumes and prayer. She walked off under her own power, which not many of them did, and she stood in front of my desk, with her hands folded, like she'd been taught to stand that way before she could walk. Gray-blue skin, the color of dust after rain, eyes too large and too dark, the kind that don't blink when you expect them to. Ash-colored hair cropped short, like she'd cut it herself with something that wasn't meant for cutting hair. The ledger looked at her file for 4 seconds and marked her non-viable. Insufficient documented skills, no sponsor, no claim. I asked her name. That wasn't in the protocol. The protocol wanted a case number and a thumbprint and a signature on the hold order. She looked at me like the question surprised her, like no one had asked in some time, and after a moment she said, "Illith." Nothing after it. I wrote it in the margin of the file, where nobody but me would ever read it, next to the number that was about to decide the rest of her life. She went into the long hold wing that first week, same as the others. I brought her real food twice, when I could get it past the count. An orange, once, still cold from cold storage, and she held it in both hands, like she didn't know what to do with something that hadn't been processed into paste first. She didn't eat it right away. She turned it over, studying the skin of it, and when she finally broke it open, the smell filled the whole intake booth, and for just a moment, she closed her eyes. "You don't have to do this," she told me the second time, when I brought a blanket that actually held heat, instead of the thin synth sheets standard issue. "The ledger doesn't care what you bring me." "I know," I said. "I'm not doing it for the ledger." She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she'd expected one existed. She talked, some days, in pieces that didn't fit together. A court that no longer existed. A season with 6 colors instead of 4. A way of counting years by the length of someone's hair. She never gave me enough to place her, and I understood after a while that this was deliberate. Once a trader passing through recognized the stitch pattern on a scarf she kept close, and asked, too casually, where she'd gotten it. She told him it was her grandmother's and nothing more, and didn't sleep easy that whole cycle. I flagged her file for my review only, so no one else would be the one reading it. 6 months. That's how long her review sat in queue while I filed extensions I wasn't sure were legal, and my supervisor, a tired man named Corbin, who'd stopped believing in second chances around the same time I'd started, told me twice to let it go. "You process 100 of these a month," he said. "You don't get attached to case files." "I'm not attached to the file," I said. "I'm attached to her." He didn't have anything to say to that either, which told me he understood it better than he wanted to. I went to see her in the hold wing, more than the schedule allowed. The pods were cold, blue-lit, and she was awake in hers more often than she should have been, some flaw in the sedation the techs couldn't explain, and didn't try very hard to fix, because why would they, for a non-viable case? I'd sit on the floor across from the glass and talk to her about nothing. The weather cycles, the names of the ships coming through. Once, badly, I tried to tell her a joke that didn't survive translation. She laughed anyway, a small sound through the glass, and it was the first time I understood that I would do something reckless for her before the year was out. The reckless thing came on a Tuesday, the day her final review notice posted. Permanent hold. Transfer to the deep archive, a polite way of saying she would sleep in that pod until the pod itself gave out. I had clearance I wasn't supposed to use for this. I used it anyway. I keyed a sponsorship override into her file, my own name, my own service number, the kind of thing that gets you a formal reprimand on a good day and gets you walked out the door on a bad one. The ledger doesn't care about extenuating circumstances. It cares about signatures, and I gave it mine. Corbin found me in the booth an hour later, with the override already logged and irreversible. He read it twice. "You know what this costs you," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what it costs her if I don't," I said. He looked at me a long moment, and then, quieter than I expected, he signed the countersignature that made it hold. He never told me why. I never asked. I went to the hold wing myself to open her pod, which wasn't procedure either, but nobody stopped me. She woke slow, the way they all do, and when her eyes focused on me, she didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. I could see it settle into her face. Not relief exactly, something steadier than that, something that looked like the first solid ground she'd stood on in longer than I could guess. She reached into the seam of her sleeve, where the fabric had been stitched twice over, and drew out a small cloth patch, no bigger than a coin, worked with a thread pattern I didn't recognize. A crown, small and spare, more suggestion than image. "I kept this hidden," she said. "Every station, every review. I was crown ward of the Sorn court, before the court fell. I didn't tell you because a name like that gets a person sold to whoever still wants a claim on it. I told you the only name that was still mine to give. I didn't know what to say to a crown. I've never known what to say to one. So I said the only thing I had, which was the truth. I didn't bring you food because I thought you were a queen. I brought it because nobody else was going to." "I know," she said. "That's why I let you see me put my name in the margin." We stood there a while, the two of us, in a hold wing built for people the ledger had already decided not to count. I told her I'd walk her case through myself. All the way, however long that took. Resettlement papers, a real placement, her name spelled right on every line this time. She said she'd hold me to it. I believed her. I still do. The ledger marked her file non-viable 4 times before I stopped at a 5th. It never once asked her name. I did, and I kept asking, long after the reprimand cleared my record, and long after Corbin retired and told me, on his way out the door, that signing that countersignature was the only decision in 30 years he was sure he'd gotten right. It took the better part of 2 years to walk her papers through. Real placement, a sponsor's bond, her name spelled correctly on every line, Illith, and nothing appended, unless she chose to append it herself. She never told the resettlement board what the patch in her sleeve meant, and neither did I. Some things aren't the ledger's to know. What it knows is columns and thresholds, and the word non-viable, typed out clean and certain, as if certainty were the same thing as truth. It has never sat in a room with a person long enough to be wrong about them slowly, the way I was. One orange, one blanket, one bad joke at a time. I don't know if that makes me the kind of man this station will remember. I know it makes me the kind Illith chose to remember, and some mornings, watching her stand in real daylight instead of blue stasis light, thumb along the edge of that small stitched crown, that feels like more than enough. I still keep her name written in the margin where I first put it, in a file that reads now, in Corbin's steady hand under mine, viable, sponsored, chosen.